Afternoon, everybody. I'm John Quincy, Chair of the Ways and Means Committee, and welcome to our regularly scheduled meeting of the committee. I'm joined by committee members, council members Yang, Palomasano, Bender, and Johnson, and also happy to be joined by Councilmember Cano. We have a relatively brief agenda. We'll start with the consent items. And City Attorney's Office is bringing forward 2 settlements. City Coordinator's Office has a couple of grant acceptance and a contract execution. The Convention Center brings forward an item truing up the 1% lodging tax with the Meet Minneapolis budget and some snow plowing removal services contract, replacement bid for the wall fabric, and some elevator work bids. The Finance Department is just bringing forward one appointment for Lindsay Walschlager to serve on CLIC. Information Technology Department continues its contract amendments to keep moving forward a number of, this is on the computer-aided dispatch system support. The Community Development Committee, Regulatory Services Committee brings forward 5 items. Including a TIF plan modification for DC Group, the Lake and Nicollet redevelopment plan, an extension, revision of the Green Homes North program Round 3 funding awards and land sales, Metropolitan Council Livable Communities demonstration account, transit-oriented development grants, and the spring 2014 environmental grant funding round. The Health, Environment, and Community Engagement Committee is bringing forward the Mississippi Watershed Management Organization grant, GRO 1000, the Garden and Green Spaces Award, accepting and executing agreements, as well as the Spay and Neuter Assistance Program lease extension and Human Services Research Grant. Public Safety, Civil Rights, and Emergency Management Committee is bringing forward the Financial Crimes Task Force acceptance of a grant, as well as a Forensic Science Improvement Program grant award. TPW is bringing forward some resurfacing projects, and authorizing execution and subordinate funding agreement with the Central Corridor LRT project, acceptance of a low bid with A&M Construction for Phase 3 of the Water Treatment Distribution Division, and rescinding the resolution canceling the agreement or the street resurfacing project at Johnson Street Northeast. So those are the items on the consent agenda. Are there any items that anybody has any questions or would like to pull off for further discussion? We're good. So I would move all those items for approval. With approval, please say aye.
Aye.
And opposed, those items carry. Thank you for all that staff work and the committee work that moved those items forward. And we get to the big star of the show as we're continuing our deep dives into major components of our financial services division explanation of the budget process. The last meeting, you recall we had a recap of the 2013 budget and its final numbers, pre-audit, and as well as a deep explanation of our debt service kind of programs and understanding of that. So today's topic, we continue that direction with the explanation of our city revenue sources. So with that, Ms. Christensen, if you could join us.
Thank you, Chair Quincy and members of the committee. As the Chair just explained, we are making an attempt to come forward in advance of the 2015 budget process to provide a little bit of background in terms of what actually happens, what are the bones of a city budget and the city's financial resources. So you've seen a little background on some of the city's longer term obligations, and today we're going to look at some of the resources that we use to fund our annual operating and capital budget. So I'll just dive in. Please don't hesitate to ask questions as we're going through. I tend to talk fast, so if I am talking too fast, please let me know and I'll slow down. So the point of this slide is to really give you an overview of the number of different types of revenue sources that is comprised of the city budget. There's charges for services, which you'll see is actually one of the larger types of revenues that we'll see in the city budget. But you see we also have fees and permits for fees and license permits, fines and forfeitures. We get money from other intergovernmental agencies, and by intergovernmental, I'm talking the federal government, the state government, maybe even Hennepin County, as well as the school district in some cases, depending on services that we're providing. We also receive other income through investment of our in-house resources. We do have money in the bank, as you learned from the last meeting at the end of our 2013 results. We try to actively manage the resources that we have on hand and generate investment income to the extent that we're able, even with the poor investment market that we have right now. There are other financing opportunities, including selling bonds. We learned about that at the last meeting, that the city takes advantage of opportunities to utilize its good name and good credit rating, issue bonds, borrow money when it's more prudent to do that. So other financing sources may include bond proceeds or money that we're borrowing. It also includes utilization of money that we have in the bank or our fund balance. And then taxes. We have property taxes. We also have our local sales taxes. TIF is another type of tax. And franchise fees are kind of a quasi, don't quite have a home. Our rulemaking board requires us to call franchise fees a tax, but it's really more of a fee. And I'll get into that in more detail. As I just mentioned, one of the major sources of the city's revenue is charges for services. It comprises about 36% of the total city budget. And for the most part, the charges for services that we have are for utility rates and charges. You know, we've got the water fund, we have provide water services, sanitary sewer, stormwater, and solid waste services. We charge the residents and the commercial properties for utilization of those services. So they get the monthly bill, and that's essentially what your utility rates and charges are. We are also able to charge for services that the city provides that are over and above the basic services. For example, when there are events at the previously existing dome facility down the street, occasionally the city would allow the organization to hire off-duty police officers or on duty to provide extra security, and we do charge for that. We don't necessarily provide that as a gratis service. We also have parking revenues. As you know, we do have parking facilities on-street and off-street. We also do collect for abating nuisance properties, and what this means is we've got various property codes that require that weeds don't exceed a certain height, or that you don't allow junk to accumulate in your yard, and that type of activity. And if that does happen following advance notice or several notices, we will hire someone to come in and take care of that problem, but we do charge that back to the property owner. We will charge an amount sufficient to cover what we've paid to have that service done. We also have special assessments. As you know, we collect from property owners a portion of the cost of street repairs and sidewalks, and we also assess to the property at the end of the year any unpaid utility bills. And so if someone has gone half a year or so without paying their water bill, we'll give them a notice, and if they don't provide payment by the end of November, it will be tacked on to their next year's property taxes. And again, as I alluded to, the utility rates and charges are mainly for what we call our business type activities. We have water, sanitary sewer, stormwater, and our solid waste and recycling. And when I say business type activities, how we handle these types of revenues and expenses associated with them is we maintain the water service as basically a separate business unit. It's part of the city, but we don't want to be mixing resources back and forth. So property taxes don't subsidize the water, the sewer. Basically, it's a fee for service. If you use X amount of water, that's what you're going to be paying for, and it's a fairly self-sustaining operation.
Where do these show up? I remember in our last meeting we talked about the overall budget. Mm-hmm. These are not special revenue funds. These are enterprise funds?
Yes, these are classified as enterprise funds, meaning that they are run as a separate enterprise or a separate business. They roll up into the total city budget, and later in the presentation, I have a couple of charts that should portray that.
Okay.
The next area is one that typically gets a fair amount of discussion, and that is the license and permit fees. Just a little background and information regarding fees in general. Governmental entities, local governments are allowed to charge fees for the services that they provide. However, they can't charge more than what the actual cost of that service is. That's a state law. That is something that we take into consideration whenever we're setting fees for particular types of activities. So as I've noted on the slide, we may set a fee, but we're not required to. In many cases, there are things, activities that the city may choose to do as a policy matter and believe that there's enough public good associated with it that we don't want to be charging individual fees for that activity. However, on the other hand, there may be activities that are only being provided to certain individuals or certain groups or certain add-on type of activities that it is reasonable to add an additional charge to that service. So again, we may charge up to the full cost of the service. We can choose to do something between nothing and the full cost, and that's a policy decision by all of you. The city does have a fee schedule. We bring it forward by, I believe it is September 1st of each year, and that allows us for an opportunity to communicate any changes in the fees to the various license holders, as well as holding a public hearing, which is necessary by state law for liquor license holders.
Can you just real quickly just kind of give a couple of examples of some of those typical fees that we may be looking at on an annual basis that, you know, we all lump together as fees, but
Right,
break out?
absolutely. There's several different types of fees. We have fees that are charged for specific types of businesses that may want to operate within the community. So there's restaurant license fees, generally are related to the cost of having inspections, making sure that the fire inspector's there so that they're not exceeding the maximum occupancy per square foot. And then there's also the health inspections that go along with that. And as we've been going through and taking deeper dives into looking at the city's fee structure, what we're finding is it's really very surprising as to how many activities are actually encompassed in providing for a license for any one type of business. So again, we've got our restaurant licenses. We may have some other kind of a food vendor. For liquor licenses, when we issue new liquor licenses, we have to do background checks on the people that want to open up that establishment to make sure that they're someone we want to do business in town. There's also entertainment-related fees. For example, if someone were to literally do a dog and pony show, we might require them to come in and get a permit to provide for some kind of entertainment that is taking place on the city's streets. Again, I mentioned the liquor licenses. They vary in nature by the size of the establishment and its location within the community. And then another type of fee that you'll see is charged is for our building and construction activity. Those are generally permits. Much of what we charge through the permitting process is outlined for us in the state building code and the state statutes. There's a standard fee that's charged, and then on top of that, as you may be aware, depending on the value of the renovation being done, there's an adjustment to the cost of the permit. And then also there are types of fees that we call loss of use. And on the slide here, I've labeled it as activity related. What that is something along the lines of a contractor needs to have a dumpster available for them to use during one of their construction projects, and there's no place for them to put it other than on the street. The city does incur, the city and its residents incur cost associated with not being able to use that lane, and so we do charge a fee for the loss of use associated with that lane. So those are a few examples. If there's, I can certainly.
I think the big takeaway I always have learned with our fee structure is that it's just not a revenue generating model. It's just not trying to make money at it. It's to offset costs of producing or providing services that are associated with those fees. Is that?
Chair Quincy, that's an excellent point. I hesitate to ever comment that the city uses fees as a revenue generator. We do not. We charge fees to recoup a cost that we've already incurred. Again, we can't charge more than what it costs us to do it. So by nature, it's not a revenue generator. It recoups our cost.
Right. Go ahead, Councilmember Palmisano, go ahead.
Thank you, Ms. Christensen. I'm just curious, in terms of our building permits and in terms of the things that get contracted through CPED, do we ever look across different municipalities like nearby to see how our fee structures or penalty structures compare to that of our neighbors? And what would we do with that information?
Chair Quincy, Councilmember Palmisano, we do on an annual basis when revising and reviewing the city's fee structure, not just for building permits, but really across the board, because there is kind of a market component to setting some of these fees. We do look at the neighboring cities, and as kind of a check and balance, the state does require each municipality to provide an annual report showing how much they've collected in terms of permit revenues versus the value of the permits that were issued, and then the cost of providing that service. So there is a little bit of a policing function that goes on that, but certainly we do want to look around and see what our neighboring cities are doing and ensuring that we're not out of line.
Thanks.
Yeah, I think that's a fair question, because we don't want to be providing fees that, don't generate the business opportunity that we're trying to seek or overburden a business owner, for example. But we need to be competitive, and we need to recover as much cost as we can to provide those services on an enterprise-wide basis. So that's a fine market tolerance versus common sense review. We don't want to be priced out of the market, but we don't want to leave any money on the table to provide important services.
The next category of revenues that we use to fund city services are fines and forfeitures, and they're pretty much limited to traffic and parking citations, animal control violations. We do also account for penalties that we charge for if there's an individual who has done construction work without a permit. The typical rule of thumb is to charge double the permit fee. So half of that cost would be charged as a penalty and would be accounted for in this area. The majority of the revenues that we receive in this area are collected by the state. The state has the court system. They collect the fines and then they pass them on through to us. So we do get payment once a month and receive the fines that are due to us.
You said the state. Do you mean the county as well as when you
the
get to
state does, yeah.
parking citations go through the state? Mm-hmm. I thought that was through district court.
District court is a state function.
I got you. Thank you. I thought that was actually part of our county. Good to know.
I alluded earlier to a category known as intergovernmental revenues, and they were mainly comprised of federal and state aids and grants. Now, the difference between a grant and an aid is typically a grant is provided to an organization with specific types of activities that need to be accomplished with those resources. So as I've noted down here, transportation funding is typically allotted for particular projects. Those are what we would call discretionary grants. We would apply for it, generally a competitive process, and when the money is allotted, it must be used for that purpose that we applied for, saying that we want to use it for a specific interchange or a specific roadway. Block grants are another type of grant. We receive grants such as CDBG, and we are required to provide certain types of services, certain categories. It's not very prescribed, but it's more of a category of services that we need to provide to the local community utilizing those resources. And then another type of discretionary grants that we receive are COPS and SAFER grants, and they are specific grants that we receive for the police department, COPS, I guess aptly named, and SAFER, which is for supplemental staffing in the fire department. And I did include a little asterisk on here, particularly as it pertains to grants such as COPS and SAFER. that when we are entering into these grant applications and acceptances, we need to make sure that we're aware of any what I'll call long-term strings that are attached to receiving those funds. For example, with the COPS grant, we're provided 2/3 of the cost of bringing on new staff, but it's a declining balance of funding. So the federal money will decline over the course of several years, and then by entering into that grant agreement, the city must agree to continue funding those new positions for several years. So we need to be looking further down the line when we enter into some of these agreements.
I think especially when we're talking about grants or any kind of other upstream funding, there's always going to be legs and tails that we have to take into account. Sometimes it's not worth it to take the short-term fusion of cash because there's going to be a long-term implication that makes it very harder to implement and administer over time. So whenever a department is proposing a grant application, that's one of the reasons it comes to this committee and it goes through our finance department. Is this something we should be doing? In addition to the policy work, we're looking at it from a financial relevance and importance and viability over a long period. So
Good point.
always want to interject, but feel free to just start talking when you're bored.
Another example of a type of grant that we want to at least have an awareness of, several years ago, Homeland Security was providing significant amounts of funding for purchases of protective equipment and heavy-duty vehicles and other assorted types of capital. And typically the city, when purchasing our own capital, has a replacement plan built in. And when we have other people's money and are purchasing the equipment in that manner, sometimes we are surprised that all of a sudden we need to replace that equipment. So utilizing other external resources has to be done in a thoughtful manner. And moving on to state of Minnesota revenues, we do receive several types of aid from the state. I'm sure that you're all familiar with local government aid, or LGA. Has been a revenue source that's been a very significant part of the city's budget over the years, but is actually kind of declining in terms of its proportional share of funding for the city, and I'll show you a chart momentarily. Municipal state aid is a funding source that we are able to utilize to assist us in road repairs and maintenance for roads, because a lot of the streets that go through the city of Minneapolis are actually state highways. So we are able to enter into I'd say a cost-sharing agreement with the state and utilize resources in that manner. Fiscal disparities is another system that allows for redistribution of essentially the value of the properties within the metro area. And I will get more into fiscal disparities at our next session when we're talking more about property taxes, because it's highly related to that area. There are also discretionary grants that are available to local governments. I use lead abatement as a particular example. There's also many other human services grants that our health department is able to utilize to help support their programs. Further, Hennepin County, in some of our activity areas, particularly in street repairs and maintenance, we are able to enter into cost-sharing agreements with Hennepin County, so we do have the ability to share the expenses associated with that, which is also true with the Metropolitan Council. As I alluded to a moment ago, the share of LGA as a proportion of the city's overall general fund budget, you'll see, has actually been declining over time. In 2002, LGA was about 40% of the city's general fund budget. In 2013, it was down to 18%, and in 2014, it's down to 17%. And that in large part is due to, over time with the unallotments and the reduction in the base of the LGA, the city has, in addition to reducing its budget over the years, it's had to look to other revenue sources. So we've tried to maximize our ability to recoup our costs, again, through prudently assessing fees where they're appropriate. But also, you'll see there has been an impact on the property taxes. In 2013, the general fund was funded by 45% property taxes, and we've been able to bring that down to 34%, as you're aware, with reduction in the property tax for 2014, and that certainly is a big help in that area.
Yeah, proportionally, though, what it's showing is the LGA is not eating that difference up. This is showing our other sources of revenue. And these are the grant programs, other things that you had just outlined. But it really shows, obviously, since 2002 to 2013, that the change in the LGA program, I refuse to call it aid, I still consider it a revenue sharing model, has never, or is really squeezed and asked a lot more from local property taxpayers.
That's correct, and we've shown on this chart that the city has become more self-reliant in terms of funding its budget and less reliance upon the state. The ever-popular category of miscellaneous revenues, I will give you a few examples of those types of revenues. They, again, I alluded to investment income earlier. The city is by statute limited as to the types of investments that we can make with our resources on hand. They're generally very safe. They have to be a high quality, and the safer they are, usually the lower the interest rate. So in the recent environment, interest income has been little bit constrained. We're also able to sell some of our surplus materials, and that shows up as a miscellaneous revenue. And in some cases, we also receive donations and contributions. Most often, we'll see these in the police department. We'll see donations related to the K-9 program and other such activities. It's a rather minor portion of the overall budget. And earlier, I also alluded to the other financing sources. We are able to borrow money at relatively low rates because of our excellent credit rating, as well as the reputation of the city. It's a high-quality paper. It trades well in the market, and we are able to take advantage of the market acceptance of the city of Minneapolis borrowing. And I know at your last session, Mr. Carpenter had explained to you how the credit markets work and how the city borrows, and why sometimes it's a better idea to borrow than it is to utilize some other financing source. Transfers between funds, these are really more of an accounting mechanism than they are much of anything else. For the purposes of comparisons from year to year, we try to eliminate transfers because all they do is show how we're shuffling money internally. So we try to tend not to discuss them too deeply. And again, fund balance is certainly a funding opportunity for the city. As you were informed at your last meeting, the city was able to see positive results in its fund balance in the general fund for 2013. What this does is it allows the city to have a buffer, so to speak, for years in which unforeseen circumstances such as LGAN allotments occur, or if the economy has declined and our building permits go down. So it's important that we have a sufficient amount of money in our fund balance to account for those years when something unusual happens. The other category of city revenues is taxes. There are several different types of taxes that we use to fund the city's budget on an annual basis. Property taxes are certainly one form. They comprise a significant portion of the city's budget. Not quite as much as charges and services, but it's right up there. We'll spend more time at our next meeting to discuss kind of the nitty-gritty of how property taxes work and the history of property taxes within the city. Local sales taxes, we do have 4 different types of local sales tax within the community. We have sales and use tax, which was a general sales tax. We have a liquor tax, which is 3%, and that's only in the downtown area. Entertainment taxes are linked to entertainment venues and sales of tickets for entertainment, and lodging, aptly named, is for the utilization of hotels within the city. I do have additional information regarding the city's local sales taxes that I would be happy to send an electronic link to you so that you can read more detail about how they're determined and where they are applicable within the city.
What is the local sales and use tax? What is that rate?
That is 0.5%.
Okay. And that's applied citywide for anything purchased?
Correct.
Except for tax-exempt items?
Right. It's
food,
just like
clothing.
the regular state sales tax.
Right. And are we constrained on what we can use these sources of revenues for? For example, liquor, entertainment, lodging taxes, those suite of hospitality taxes in the downtown. Are we limited, or what do we have to do with those monies?
We are not limited in how those resources are utilized. Up until a couple of years ago, there was some constraint on utilizing the resources to costs associated with the city's entertainment venues, most notably the convention center. However, recent legislation has freed up any strings that were attached to the utilization of those local taxes. So they are available for citywide consumption at this time. And as a response to that, we are including the local sales taxes as part of the general fund budget in recognition of the fact that they are available for general consumption.
Right. That's when it becomes a budget conversation for this body, and we're able to make choices. But at the moment, our policy is that those are primarily for economic development purposes or capital infrastructure purchases, not day-to-day operations of various activities or programs.
Correct.
But that's just a policy conversation that we'll have every year between August and December. There was another thought I wanted everybody. How are the sales taxes performing over time, the last 10 years, the next 5 years? What are they projected to be?
The local sales taxes continue to grow. Clearly, during the economic downturn, there was a few lean years in terms of collection of the local sales taxes. We're looking at about $70 million in the aggregate on an annual basis for collections of all 4 of those taxes.
And I think also Meet Minneapolis has a carve-out, a given percentage that funds that program. Is that right? Do you remember off the top of your head what that?
I think it is 1%, I just had that, of the lodging tax.
That
Yes,
goes back-
1% of the 2.625% lodging tax.
Totally appropriate use of that, because the Meet Minneapolis's job is to sell the city, and its output is in the lodging tax, so they should receive that money so they can keep doing a bigger job to generate more tax revenue for the city.
That's correct, and that's a decision that can be made by the Ways and Means Committee and the whole council on an annual basis as to how, whether that's a sufficient amount.
Go ahead, Councilmember.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I was just curious if there had been conversation about extending the liquor tax outside of downtown and why it's just in that area and not others.
Chair Quincy, Councilmember Bender, that's an excellent question for which I have no answer. I am not currently aware of any discussions that have taken place regarding extending the boundaries of that tax, but it's certainly food for thought.
Or at least liquor for thought.
Liquor for thought.
One of the things I think we need to point out is this is a state special law that creates this taxing authority.
Right.
So it has to be created by the state first, and then on the city's request, and then we accept that special law. I heard that. Go ahead. Did I answer your quick question, or you have more?
I'm not sure my constituents would want me to extend the liquor tax outside of downtown, so I don't want to give that impression. I was just curious about the background. Thank you.
We heard it here first. Councilmember
Okay.
Bender wants everybody taxed and uptown.
One last item that is accounted for under tax, but in reality is more of a fee, are revenues that we characterize as franchise fees. The major utilities within the city do have the ability to utilize the city's right-of-way to run their supply lines. For example, the electrical lines run in the boulevard, the gas lines run through the city right-of-way. In exchange for utilization of that city's property, there is a franchise agreement with the various utilities for which, based upon volume, they do remit funds to the city. In total, that's about $26 million on an annual basis between all of the utilities.
All of the utilities, including Excel,
Electric,
Centerpoint.
gas, and cable.
And so Comcast as
Yeah.
well. Thank you.
And to add a little bit of interest to the presentation, I included a couple of pie charts just showing the magnitude of these various revenue sources in relation to others for the total city budget. So you'll see, as I alluded to earlier, charges for services are about 36, almost 40% of the overall budget for the city. Budget for 2014 is $1.2 billion. Charges for services associated in large part with utility fees and sewer and water, et cetera, $432 million. Property taxes are another significant portion, $276 million of the overall city budget. And you'll see that the other categories that we've discussed can make up the rest. And for comparison purposes, this slide just shows the variations in the annual collections of revenues or estimates for funding for these 2 budget years. You'll see that charges for services are up somewhat between 2013 and 14, interest and other revenues as well. Other financing sources, including utilization of fund balance, increased between the 13 and 14 budget. And the other sources have been maintained relatively similar to their prior years.
Yeah, please, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. For the other financing, you mentioned that the jump has to do with, you said the use of
Fund balance.
fund balance. So that means the city has saved money over the years and we're kind of using that to do other programs and operations.
Chair Quincy, Councilmember Cano, that's correct. Over the years, due to prudent budgeting and people underspending and the recovery in the economy has allowed our fund balance to grow bits at a time, but identifying in the 2014 budget process that there was some short-term needs that would be appropriate to fund with one-time funding sources. Fund balance is typically, like your savings account at home, you may want to dip into it to buy one big purchase, but you don't want to start using it to pay for your annual electric or for your monthly electric bill. So fund balance, if it grows, is appropriate for short-term expenditures.
Thank you.
And from a financial planning policy point of view, we're trying to get about a 25% or so in the fund balance contingency funds, so we can anticipate or be prepared for unanticipated expenditures, whether it's a snow budget or something unusual, that we're able to do that without going back in and reopening property tax conversations or other budget items, or other programs would be at risk if we weren't able to support that. It's a
Correct, and that's a very good point, Chair Quincy, that the fund balance allows for us to buffer against large swings in the need to generate property taxes. So we're able to, in good times and in bad times, we're able to smooth any lumps and bumps that we might see in terms of what the property tax levy would need to be.
Yeah, exactly. And in fact, that's a good use of contingency funds when we have an excessive fund balance, that it could be used for property tax relief as well. So it just lowers the levy that we'd have to ask for. It would be used as a one-time punch, though.
Correct. The next slide is reflective of only the city's general fund. The general fund is really the area in which of the city's budget that the basic city services are housed. So you'll see your fire department, your police department, public works, your administrative services are all going to be services that are provided for within the city's general fund. And in order to pay for those activities, you'll see that the property tax is one of the largest funding sources, which is really appropriate because the basic city services are funded by one of the most basic revenue sources for the city, which is the property tax. We aren't necessarily able to determine discrete activities or discrete benefits and are unable to maybe charge a fee for one specific activity. So property tax as a major funding source for the general fund activities is very appropriate. And you'll also see the inclusion of the local sales taxes in the 2014 budget. And as I reflected in a previous slide, the comparison between 2014 and 2013 budgets for the general fund does show that we have now begun accounting for the local sales taxes within the general fund in 2014. In the second from the bottom line, you'll see that the increases reflected from approximately $14 million to $72 million. That is not indicative of an increase in expenditures. It's merely indicative of a increase in the revenue and where we're accounting for it.
So the difference between 2013 and 2014, rather than looking at the individual line items, I look at the totals. What's that equal? 30? How much is that? The difference between the two is $100 million or $80 million or something?
Correct. It's approximately a $100 million increase, due in large part to, again, the local sales tax is now being accounted for in the general fund. As you're aware, we also received an increase in the allocation of local government aid. In the general fund, that accounts for about $10 million.
Sure.
And as we discussed a moment ago, the utilization of fund balance is now reflected in 2014. So the line item with $24.6 million is indicative of the amount of fund balance in the general fund that's being used for 2014 compared to none for the previous year.
So, but it doesn't equate to what we did with the levy itself, because the levy was actually down 1.5%.
Correct. If you take a look at the third from the bottom line that indicates property taxes, you'll see that for the general fund, the property taxes actually went down from about $171 million to the $160. And that's due directly to the reinstatement of the LGA and our ability to garner other resources.
Okay.
So with that, there are a few key takeaways that I would like to wrap up our discussion today. Again, as we've found, the city's budget is funded by many different types of sources. Some of them fluctuate, some of them are a little more static, some of them are outside of our control. Again, the allocations from the state are not necessarily something that we can determine or influence. The market in the economy will determine the amount of permit revenues that are brought in through our construction code services area. General fund revenue sources are typically not restricted in use, which is why we call them general fund. City activities, again, do not generate revenue. Referring back to our discussion about permit and license fees, we don't generate revenue, although we are able to recoup our cost. And we will be coming forward with more discussion regarding the city's fees. Staff have been working to do a thorough analysis of the city's existing fee structure and to provide information for you decision makers to determine whether or not we're sizing them appropriately or if we want to make any adjustments to them. So we'll be coming forward with that.
Yeah, that particular report, I just want to point out to my colleagues here, is that was a result of a staff direction in previous budget years. Said we knew that this money was piling up in certain areas and underspent in other areas, and we felt it was really important to have a real understanding of where we're getting our license fees, what's happening with this trend, what are we using these resources, and should we be right-sizing those fee schedules. So that's part of the output of just financial review and analysis of previous years.
Correct. It was part of the 2013 adopted budget staff direction.
Yeah, it was a big concern or interest area of Vice President Glidden's in particular. And so we're looking forward to that report, which will help shape a policy in the coming year.
Thank you. Yes.
Please, go ahead, Councilor.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. From sort of a financing strategy perspective, I mean, is our goal to grow our fund balance, to just kind of manage day-to-day operations and growth, so we're, maybe just cutting even or, just kind of achieving an equilibrium? Obviously, we don't want to lose money or not have money to fund the operations we need, but just sort of from your, I guess, staff perspective, what's kind of the approach that the city has been taking on sort of money and how we deal with money?
Chair Quincy, Councilmember Cano, we try to maintain a stable fund balance at an appropriate level. And what that means is how much money do we need to have in the bank that makes the rating agencies think that we're an attractive bet on issuing debt? How much money do we need to cover our cash flow needs? because property taxes only come in twice a year. We need to have money in the bank to cover us until the property taxes come in. What do we need to cover unforeseen circumstances? So we need to do more or less a risk analysis. What's the worst case scenario, but then what's the likelihood of the worst case scenario happening, and then determining what our balance should be. We don't want to have high balances because that is, then it's underutilized funds. But we also don't want to have a balances so low that we're at risk of having to borrow money to meet our regular operating needs. So it is kind of a delicate balance to determine what do we need, but not more than we need. And that's an excellent segue into the last bullet about the opportunities afforded by having fund balance, that we are able to buffer volatility. We can smooth out changes in property taxes. It allows us to take care of one-time needs. If we have large capital needs, we can utilize funds in the bank rather than having to borrow or to raise taxes in order to pay for them. It also covers other revenue deficits in years in which we don't receive sufficient revenues from other sources, and also in the years in which our expenses exceed budget, when we have big snow years and we have to have folks on the street plowing snow and our budgets are strained. So fund balance is available for that purpose. And that is my summary of city revenues.
That's pretty exciting work. Tell me, you identify several sources here on your end slide for additional information. You said you had some other handouts?
Yes, Chair Quincy, I have some additional reference pieces regarding LGA, the new LGA formula, fiscal disparities and how that's determined and allocated, as well as a summary from the Department of Revenue regarding the city's local taxes. And I'll be happy to forward a link to those resources to you so you can review them at your leisure.
Very good. Thank you. If we just put that link on the committee report, would be very helpful. So we don't have to send that out around, and the rest of the public can see what we're doing too. So this ends volume 2 or 2.5, maybe 3 of a 5-volume set of information. Are there any additional thoughts, questions, comments from my friends up here? Sounds great. Thank you very much, Ms. Christensen, for that report. And we look forward to the next round, which is going to be on property taxes on May 5th, followed by the May 19th committee meeting, which will talk about city expenditures. And we look forward to those as well. This item, I guess, we'll just receive and file. And in the interest of doing official work and make our clerk happy, all those in favor of this report being filed, please say aye. And that surprisingly passes. So we will conclude our business today, and we stand adjourned. Thank you.